Hello and welcome, dear students. Today we are going to discuss an important topic, that is Quentin Skinner's approach to interpretation. The main objectives of this lecture are to understand Quentin Skinner's contribution to the history of ideas, to outline Skinner's approach to interpreting text, to highlight the shortcomings of textualist approaches, to explain the common mistakes made by historians in interpretation, to find the precise method of attaining the meaning of the text. Quentin Skinner is a well-known name in history, political theory and linguistic philosophy. He is renowned in the field of hermeneutics, that is, the science of interpretation, for his unique method of textual interpretation, particularly when applied to political and historical contexts. His book, The Foundations of Modern Political Thought, is regarded as an exemplar of intellectual history for its contribution to historiographic methodology as well as interplay of political thought and action during the European Renaissance. He emphasized the importance of placing texts in their historical setting and thus departed from the traditional method in political theory, which consisted in tracing the progression of classic texts and examining each work in relation to the canon of Western political thought. He shared this contextual approach with John Pocock, John Donne, and together they came to be known as the Cambridge School of Intellectual History. Their methodology has had a significant impact on the study of political and intellectual history. The Cambridge School is characterized by its adherence to a particular form of linguistic contextualism, which holds that political texts can only be correctly understood when placed within their intellectual context, and that this intellectual context can only be fully understood in terms of the language that individual authors used and had access to. Understanding the language used by an author to make a specific claim is therefore essential to understanding a text. Language is viewed here both as a structural constraint, as it restricts the actions of the author, as well as a resource for agency, as it provides the author with various modes of expression and action. Compared with the other methodological traditions that the Cambridge School has successfully displaced, language is situated as the source of both structure and agency in the latter's approach. Popularly, his approach is taken as a direct critique of the textual approach to interpretation of texts, which was pioneered by Leo Strauss. Textualists stress on a careful interpretation involving reading between the lines to understand the meaning of the text. Such an interpretation does not move beyond the text, is not concerned with the context, motives and intentions of the author, as it believes such aspects of the author's life cannot be identified or quantified and constitute a misleading method of reading the text. For them, the author disguises the meaning within the text itself, and a meticulous reading would allow us to know that meaning. Skinner disputed almost all the premises of textualists in framing his contextualist approach. James Tully summarizes Skinner's approach in 5 steps. First, the force or the point of the author has to be understood along with the propositional meaning. Second, to place the text in its practical context, to understand what the author is doing to manipulate the available ideological conventions. Third, to survey minor texts to identify the constitutive regulations of reigning ideologies, because it is in reference to them that classical texts become benchmarks as they challenge the commonplaces of that period. Fourth, to place the text in its ideological context and analyze its relation with social action, as ideologies play a role in legitimating social action. Fifth and the last, to explain how ideological change gets embedded with a way of acting and becomes conventional, or simply how language constitutes the character of its practices. So first let us look at Quentin Skinner's critique of existing schools. Skinner's approach is built on the inadequacies that he found in existing modes of interpretation of texts. He criticizes presentism, which is the propensity to view historical texts through the prism of modern concepts and values. He contends that by imposing contemporary concerns and categories on historical texts, presentism distorts their meanings. He is an advocate of contextualism, a method that considers the language, ideas, and intellectual environment of the time in order to understand texts within their historical context. He criticizes interpretive strategies that give certain ideas or terms a presumptive timeless meaning. According to him, words and concepts can have different meanings depending on the historical setting. As a result, understanding how these ideas were perceived by the authors and those around them at the time is necessary for properly interpreting historical texts. Approaches that attempt to locate a systematic philosophy or ideology from a thinker's works are criticized by Skinner. He contends that many political theorists engaged in a variety of ideas and arguments in response to particular historical circumstances rather than having a predetermined doctrine. There is a risk of oversimplification and incorrect interpretation when looking for systematic coherence. When interpreting texts, Skinner emphasizes the importance of recovering the author's intentions. He opposes methods that ignore or minimize the role of authorial intent in favor of uncovering implicit or latent meanings. He contends that accurate interpretation requires a knowledge of the author's intended message that he wished to convey to its intended audience. Skinner's critique emphasizes the significance of acknowledging the historical specificity of ideas and concepts. He criticizes methods that treat some concepts as timeless truths or ahistorical. Instead, he advocates for understanding ideas in the context of their historical and cultural evolution. He takes into account the role of language in shaping the method of interpretation and resultant meaning. He criticizes methods that isolate language from historical context and linguistic norms, contending that language is a vital tool for comprehending the motivations and goals of historical actors. His commitment to a contextual and historically sensitive approach to the study of political and philosophical texts leads his criticism of interpretive schools. Instead of forcing modern or universal interpretations on historical texts, he encourages scholars to engage with them on their own terms, while respecting the historical context and authorial intent. His work has significantly influenced intellectual history and increased the acceptability of the complexity of historical texts and concepts. Quentin Skinner speaks of some mythologies in his approach and criticism of textual schools. During the exercise of interpretation, Skinner says that historians commit some common mistakes. He calls them mythologies. These concepts lead to his own approach to the interpretation of political texts and ideas. Here is an explanation of each of these mythologies, which he believes to be at the core of misunderstanding classical texts. First, the mythology of coherence. Skinner defines mythology of coherence as the propensity to impose a systematic or coherent philosophical structure onto the writings of political thinkers by filling in the gaps and voids that might exist in the text. He contends that this method, which looks for an internally consistent theory within a thinker's works, can produce misleading and incorrect interpretations. Instead, Skinner considers the text to be a product of its own historical context. It contains a variety of viewpoints expressed in the writer's thinking. Because early thinkers frequently wrote for distinct audiences and purposes, their writings may not be as internally consistent as readers in the modern era might assume. They often wrote in response to specific historical and political circumstances, addressing particular issues or engaging in polemics with contemporaries. Thus, searching for an overarching, coherent theory or ideology within the works of thinkers from the past is the first mythology of interpretation. Skinner's mythology of coherence, therefore, advocates a historically sensitive and contextually informed approach to the interpretation of political texts. A prominent example that can be used to highlight this problem is the difference in the political thought of Karl Marx in his earlier works and that of his later works. The works of young Marx are considered to be more concerned with the question of alienation, while as the works of old Marx indicate a shift towards scientific socialism. In fact, Marx is criticized for not being able to coherently develop his theory, which is done in fragments across his writings. As per Skinner's approach, this shift cannot be seen as a contradiction or incoherence in the political thought of Marx, but an evolution as such. The second mythology is the mythology of prolepsis. In Skinner's contextual approach, the term prolepsis refers to the practice of assigning later meanings or concepts to earlier texts or ideas. The intentions of the writer are conflated with and drawn from a subsequent action. Skinner cautions against assuming that terms or concepts had the same meanings in the past as they do today in order to read anachronistic meanings into historical texts. Prolepsis can alter the original intentions and meanings of historical texts when contemporary ideas, interpretations, or perspectives are applied to the past. There is a chance of anachronism, which could result in a misinterpretation of historical concepts. Skinner's prolepsis is closely tied to his broader method of contextualism. He believes that understanding the historical context, including the language and concepts of that period in which a text was written, is essential for accurate interpretation. By avoiding proleptic readings, scholars can better appreciate the nuances and intentions of historical authors. Again, a prominent example of this mythology is the popular narrative in which the eventualities of the dictatorial Stalin regime of USSR is thought to be a realization of Marxist teachings. Skinner argues that such imposition of later events on earlier texts is a misinterpretation of the texts and their meaning and reflects mythology of prolepsis. Or, for example, Rousseau's political views are thought to have provided the philosophical justification for the totalitarian as well as the democratic state. Thus, the emergence of totalitarianism is unequivocally attributed to him. The historical events following Rousseau's work is therefore combined with his philosophy and direct responsibility is thrust on him. The third is the mythology of doctrine. It begins with the belief that the writer has explicated some doctrines about the subject of the writing. The term doctrine in Skinner's writings refers to the particular notions, hypotheses, or arguments advanced by political theorists in their writings. Skinner insists interpreters to examine the doctrines presented in historical texts while paying close attention to the setting and audience for which they were written. He contends that in order to comprehend the doctrines of political thinkers, one must carefully analyze their terminology, ideas, and the issues they were attempting to solve at the time. Interpreters of political thought frequently treat a thinker's doctrines as rigid, static, and all-encompassing. This method is predicated on the idea that a thinker has a comprehensive philosophical system that can be easily and neatly deduced from their writings. Instead, Skinner argues that this assumption can lead to an oversimplified understanding of historical texts. He emphasizes that there are multiple themes, principles, and doctrines within a single text. These principles and doctrines can be conflicting with each other. However, such contradictions should simply be understood as the multiplicity of ideas, themes, and concepts that the writers addressed. Thus, A single and a unified doctrine may not exist and instead is created by the interpreter, which can distort the writer's intentions. This mythology is usually found in intellectual biographies, wherein the interpreter reads some disparate remarks occurring in the text as some sort of a doctrine, even though the writer may not have intended it to be so. It can also be found in history of ideas, wherein certain principles enunciated by the writer are portrayed as doctrines. Conversely, the absence of a doctrine is criticized as the writer's shortcoming for failing to stipulate a recognized doctrine about the fundamental subject of the text. This is followed by ascribing or forcing a doctrine onto the writer without evidence of such doctrine in the text. Such doctrines have been frequently thought to be existing in Marx's writings, which have been equated with economic determinism. However, even as class analysis dominated his writings, interpreters in no way can conclude that there exists no other idea beyond class in them. Skinner also uses the example of Macpherson's reading of John Locke as an advocate and defender of capitalist accumulation, contending that such threads are not to be located in Locke's political thought. Fourth and the last, mythology of parochialism. This mythology is produced when a historian incorrectly describes the intent and sense of a work. It is obvious that the historian uses his own criteria in order to attempt to understand a text. The risk here is that the historian will identify visibly familiar themes and draw an inaccurate comparison, thereby leading to an incorrect interpretation. The historian might interpret a reference to a specific statement in a classical text incorrectly. He might run into a familiar phrase elsewhere and interpret it as a reference to, a response to, or a denial of the similar phrase in other texts. The key is that the author is shown to have been influenced by the earlier text, because it is clear that he intended to make a reference to it. For instance, it is claimed that Locke was heavily influenced by Hobbes, to whom he must have referred in the second treatise, which, however, is not the case. Now we will discuss Skinner's approach. His own method takes two contexts into account. One is the linguistic context, which examines the structure of language that the author used to write a text and convey its literal meaning. Second is the historical context, which examines the particular spatial and temporal setting in which the text was written and to which the text was addressed. Thus, understanding a text or a historical figure requires placing them in their historical and intellectual context. He emphasizes the importance of understanding the language, concepts, and ideas of a particular time and place to grasp the accurate meaning of a text. He does not discard textualism completely. Instead, he argues that to interpret a text correctly, it is crucial to recover the author's intentions and the context in which the text was produced. Such added knowledge about the author's world, his worldview, and his beliefs are essential for interpreting political and philosophical texts. His approach signifies the linguistic turn in philosophy, which emphasizes the role of language in shaping our understanding of the world. He believes that language is a key tool for understanding the thoughts and intentions of authors, and it is through language that practices, norms, and values are disseminated as well as made conventional. For Skinner, the aim of interpretation is to get the message of the text and its intrinsic complexity. His history of ideas approach advocated a textual interpretation of texts, but not without a familiarization with the reader's or interpreter's preconceptions, and b a contextual interpretation of the social circumstances in which the text is written, as well as to which it is addressed. According to him, the text has three meanings. First, what do the words or the text mean? Second, what does the text mean to the reader? And third, what does the writer mean by what he says in his text? Thus, the text says as well as does, that is, the meaning and the doing both are important to understand a text. Motives and intentions are equally important because the knowledge of the writer's intentions help understand what the writer means by what he writes, which in turn helps grasp the intended illocutionary force behind writing the text. He cautions, though, to focus not only on the text but also the prevailing conventions to which the text is addressed, as well as the writer's mental world, the world of his empirical beliefs. For him, the meaning of a text cannot be divorced from the historical and linguistic context in which it was written. He believes that the interpretation of a text should take into account the specific historical circumstances, intellectual setting, and linguistic conventions of the period when it was produced. It is in reference to those situations and the popular ideas that the texts become classical as they challenge the norms, benchmarks, and dominant ideas of that time period. Skinner's contextualist understanding of meaning uses J. L. Austin's concept of speech acts to explain his method. This concept is based on the premise that linguistic utterances or locutions are performative and result in actions. That is, when individuals say things, they do things in the process, like warning, bullying, promising, etc. Thus, the meaning of an utterance is bound up in its illocutionary force, which has to be necessarily understood. The words themselves and their semantic meaning is not sufficient, but instead, what the writer was doing in saying such words to a specific person on a specific occasion is equally important. Skinner applies Austin's theory to historical texts, considering them as political speech acts, and underscores their performative nature. Speech act theory, primarily associated with philosophers like Austin and John Searle, focuses on the analysis of language as a form of action, emphasizing how words and phrases can perform various functions beyond conveying information. Skinner's work in this area primarily concerns political and historical discourse. According to the speech act theory, a text performs three acts. First, a locutionary act, the actual utterance and its literal meaning comprising any and all of its verbal, social, and rhetorical meanings. It refers to the literal meaning of the words used in a sentence. For example, open the door. Second is an illocutionary act, which is the active result or intended effect of the locutionary act. It pertains to the speaker's intention in uttering those words, including the speech act performed. Example, making a promise, issuing a command, asking a question, or for example, open the door results in an actual action. Third, a further perlocutionary act, which is the actual effect of the locutionary and the illocutionary acts, such as persuading, convincing, scaring, enlightening, inspiring, or otherwise getting someone to do or realize something, whether intended or not. It means the effect of the utterance on the listener or the recipient. Skinner pays particular attention to the illocutionary force of speech acts in political and historical contexts. He explores how various illocutionary acts, such as making a declaration, issuing a proclamation, or giving a command, play a role in shaping political discourse and actions. He examines how political actors use language to exercise authority, assert power, and influence others. He is therefore concerned with the relationship between language and political authority. He investigates how rulers, leaders, and institutions use language to legitimize their power and control. Analyzing the illocutionary acts within political discourse helps reveal the exercise of authority and the construction of political norms. It also unveils the various rhetorical strategies and speech acts used to influence public opinion, mobilize support, or justify political actions. Skinner uses Machiavelli's statement that mercenary armies always undermine liberty to explain the concept of Speech Act. Beyond the literal meaning of this remark, nothing is being said about what Machiavelli wanted out of this utterance or simply what he was doing in saying it. In order to determine this meaning, it is necessary to look to the surrounding context and analyze whether what Machiavelli said reflected the norms of that time period or it was something novel, and logically whether he was trying to authorize a given social norm or wanted to posit a new political norm. According to Skinner, therefore, the only way to arrive at a correct interpretation is to study carefully the dominant intellectual context of that time, which can then reveal the intended meaning of Machiavelli's utterances. To conclude, Quentin Skinner's contribution to the science of interpretation has revised our methods of obtaining the meaning of the text by bringing the linguistic and historical context into the domain of study, which was excluded by the earlier approaches. As is popularly conceived, his approach did not entirely displace the existing approaches, but provided an alternative method to supplement the existing schools of interpretation. In recent times, interpreters have resorted to a pluralistic approach to interpretation, which employs various approaches in combination with each other to get to the message of the classical texts. In essence, this interdependence and complementary nature of different approaches has not led to a methodological fallacy or harm, but instead has emerged as a positive facet and continues to benefit the field of hermeneutics. Skinner's revisions to his approach recently continues that trend. With this, we conclude today's lecture. Hope you benefited from listening to it. Thank you.